The first thing I noticed was that the milk was warm. Not spoiled. Not left out. Just warm, the way a glass is warm when someone has been holding it, and I had poured it myself, straight from the refrigerator, 4 minutes earlier. I remember standing at the kitchen island of a house that was not mine, in a town I had lived in for 11 days, holding a glass of milk that had no business being the temperature of a person, and thinking, very calmly, that I must have made a mistake somewhere in the last 4 minutes. I want you to understand that I am not a nervous woman. I have slept alone in bad apartments in bad neighborhoods. I once spent a winter in a cabin with no lock on the door because the frame had swollen and the bolt wouldn't seat, and I slept fine, every night, with the wind coming through the gap like a slow breath. Fear has never been my particular weakness. My weakness has always been explanation. I am very, very good at explaining things away, and by the end of this story you will see how far that can carry a person, and exactly where it sets her down. My name is Corinne. That autumn I was 41 years old, recently and quietly divorced, and I had taken a job that anyone with sense would have envied. A couple named Halvorsen owned a house on the north shore of a lake called Ellendale, 3 hours from the nearest city, and they wanted someone to live in it from September to April while they were abroad. The pay was modest, but the house was enormous and the loneliness was the point. I had a manuscript to finish. I had a marriage to finish grieving, which was harder, because I had not loved him for years and could not work out what I was grieving. I told my sister I was going to the lake to write a book. What I meant was that I was going somewhere no one could see me not writing it. The house sat on a slope above the water, all glass on the lake side, all stone and cedar on the road side. It was the kind of house built by people who wanted to feel like they were outdoors while remaining absolutely, expensively indoors. 3 floors. 6 bedrooms, though only 2 had beds in them. A kitchen the size of my first apartment. There was a wine cellar I never once opened, a sauna nobody had used in years, and a wall of windows facing west that turned the whole main floor gold for about 11 minutes every evening and then dropped it into blue. And there was the water. That was the part one couldn't get used to. Ellendale is a long lake, narrow, deep, with steep wooded sides, and at night it goes completely black. Not dark. Black. A lake at night doesn't reflect anything if there's nothing to reflect, and out there, past the deck, there was nothing. No far shore lights. No boats after September. Just a rectangle of glass showing me a rectangle of nothing, and my own face in it, if I stood in the right place. The nearest neighbor was a man named Petrus Alto, 3/4 of a mile up the shore road, 70-some years old, and I met him on my second day when he came down the drive in a truck the color of dried blood to tell me the well pump made a noise but it was nothing to worry about. He had white eyebrows like something growing on a rock, and he looked at the house the way you look at a person you have decided not to like. He said, "You're the writer." I said I was, though I hadn't written anything in 14 months. He said, 6 months alone in that house. And I said yes, and he nodded slowly, 3 or 4 times, in a way that seemed to be filing something away rather than agreeing with me. Then he said, "You'll want to keep the roadside door locked, not just the deadbolt, the top one too, the one you have to reach for. People forget the top one." I told him this seemed like a very safe area. He said, "It is. That's what makes people careless." Then he drove away, and I stood in the driveway for a while with my arms crossed, feeling the particular embarrassment of having been given advice you didn't ask for by someone who turned out to be right. The first 10 days were good. I want to be honest about that, because it makes the rest of it worse. I got up when the light did. I made coffee in a machine that cost more than my car. I walked the shore road for an hour every morning, past summer houses with their shutters closed and their docks pulled up onto the grass like beached animals, and I came back and sat at the long table by the windows with my laptop open, and I did not write, and I did not mind not writing. I read. I napped in the afternoon on a couch that swallowed me. I let the silence get into me. There's a particular quiet that a big empty house makes. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of a great deal of space that sound has to travel through. When you put a cup down on the counter, the click of it goes out across the room and comes back a fraction of a second later, and you learn the shape of the house by the way it returns your noises to you. Within a week I could tell where I was in the house with my eyes closed by the way my own footsteps sounded. Kitchen, hard and bright. Hallway, flat. Stairwell, hollow, with a slight ring to it. The upstairs landing, dead, because of the carpet. I mention this because it matters later. I want you to understand that I knew what the house sounded like. That's not vanity. That's the whole point. The milk was on the 11th night. I had gone to bed early and woken at 1:30 the way I sometimes did, with my heart going for no reason, and I went down to the kitchen because that's what I do. I make myself a warm glass of milk like a child, and I stand at the counter and drink it and go back to bed, and it works about half the time. So I poured the milk cold into a glass. Then I remembered I'd left my reading glasses on the deck table that afternoon, and I went and got them, and it was cold out there, the kind of October cold that comes off water and gets into your knuckles, and I stood on the deck maybe 2 minutes listening to the lake move. Then I came in, locked the deck door, and picked up the glass. Warm. Not hot. Skin temperature. The temperature milk is when it has been in a hand. I stood there for a long moment. Then I did what I always do. I explained it. The glass had been in the cabinet above the range, I told myself, and the range hood light had been on all day, and the cabinet was warm, and a small volume of cold milk in a warm glass equalizes fast. That's real physics. That is, I want to stress, an entirely plausible thing that could happen. I poured it out anyway and went back upstairs without any milk at all, and I lay in the dark with my eyes open, and I listened to the house, and the house sounded exactly like it always did. The next morning I checked the cabinet above the range. It was cold. I checked it 3 times over the course of the day, at different hours, and it was always cold, and by evening I had constructed a new explanation, which was that I had misremembered which cabinet, and I let it go, because that's the thing about explanations. You don't need a good one. You only need one that lets you go to sleep. 2 nights later I found the chair. The main floor had a reading chair positioned in the corner by the west windows, a heavy leather thing angled toward the lake. I'd sat in it a few times and found it too low and too soft and gone back to the couch. It faced the water at maybe a 45-degree angle, which is how it had been on the day I arrived, and how it had been in the photographs the Halvorsons sent me, because I checked, later, and I have that photograph still. That morning it faced the hallway. Not the water. The hallway, and specifically the mouth of the hallway that led to the stairs, which led up to the bedroom where I slept. I stood in the doorway with my coffee going cold and I turned that around in my head for a good 5 minutes. I had not moved it. I was sure of that in the way you are sure of things you have no evidence for. But I had also been living alone for 12 days, and I had been sleeping badly, and I had been drinking 2 glasses of wine most evenings, and I know what those 3 things do to a person's certainty. So I moved the chair back. I made a small point of it, actually. I turned it deliberately toward the water and I said out loud, "There," and my voice went out into the room and came back, and I felt ridiculous, and I went for my walk. When I came back the chair was where I'd left it. That should have been a relief. Instead it did something worse, because now I had proved to myself that the chair stayed where I put it, which meant that when it had been facing the hallway, somebody had put it there. I want to be fair to myself here. At this point I did the sensible thing, or a version of it. I walked the whole house. All 3 floors, every room, every closet, the utility room, the garage, the sauna, the space under the stairs. I did it in the middle of the day with all the lights on and the doors open, and I did not find anything, because there was nothing to find on the ground floor or the second floor or the third. What I did not check was the crawl space. There was a hatch in the floor of the utility room, a square of plywood with a recessed ring pull, sitting flush with the concrete. I knew it was there. I'd noticed it my first week and assumed it went to a sump or a water shutoff. The Halvorson's instructions, which ran to 9 typed pages and covered the coffee machine in loving detail, did not mention it at all. That absence didn't strike me as strange until much later, and when it did strike me it landed very hard. I stood over that hatch on the afternoon of day 14 with a flashlight in my hand and I did not open it, and the reason I did not open it was not fear. I want to be precise. It was that opening it would have meant admitting I believed something was wrong, and I was not ready to spend the next 5 months in a house where something was wrong. So I put the flashlight back in the drawer and I made dinner. That was the worst decision I have ever made, and I made it because I wanted to keep the evening pleasant. The noises started properly at the end of the second week. Or rather, that's when I started counting them, because they had probably been there all along, folded into the sounds a house makes. There was a soft knocking in the walls at night, which I attributed to the water pipes, and it probably was the water pipes, at least at first. There was a sound like a door easing shut, very slow, so slow you only heard the last inch of it, the small suck of air and the click. That one came from downstairs, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning, and it happened perhaps 4 times over the course of a week. And there was the smell. That's the detail people always fix on when I tell this. The smell. It wasn't strong and it wasn't rot, it was something much more ordinary and much harder to live with. It smelled like a person. Like the inside of a coat that's been worn a long time in cold weather. Warm wool and skin and old cigarette smoke, so faint that I could only catch it in the doorway of the utility room, and only sometimes, and never when I was looking for it. I'd walk past and get a lungful of another human being and stop and turn around and take a deliberate breath and there'd be nothing there but concrete and detergent. I told myself the Halvorsons had stored coats down there. I told myself it was the furnace pulling air from somewhere. I told myself I was lonely and my brain was generating company. That last one, I think, was closest to the truth in a way I didn't intend. I was lonely. Ferociously, unmanageably lonely, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in the city, and one of the effects of loneliness that nobody warns you about is that it makes you soft toward the idea of not being alone. There were nights in that third week when I heard the door click downstairs and felt, before the fear, a flicker of something almost like relief. Someone's here. I would catch myself at it and be horrified. But it was there. On the 19th night I woke up because the bedroom door was open. I sleep with it closed. Always have, since childhood, some inherited superstition from my mother. And I had closed it, because I remembered closing it, I remembered the specific resistance of the latch, which stuck a little in damp weather and needed a small push. It was standing open about 8 inches, and the landing beyond it was black, and the whole house was silent in a way that felt attentive. I lay very still. I'm not proud of that, but it's what I did. I lay on my side facing the door with my eyes open and I did not move for what must have been 20 minutes, and I watched that gap of darkness, and nothing in it moved either. Then, faintly, from somewhere below me, I heard water running. Just briefly. 6 or 7 seconds of a tap, and then off. I got up. I don't know where it came from, but I got up, and I turned on every light between my bedroom and the kitchen as I went, slapping switches with my palm, and by the time I got to the ground floor the whole house was blazing and I was breathing like I'd run somewhere. The kitchen was empty. The taps were dry. The great black windows threw the room back at me, and in the reflection I could see myself, barefoot in a t-shirt, and behind me the hallway, and nothing in the hallway. But the guest bathroom off the hall, the one I never used, had a wet sink. I stood in the doorway and looked at it. Water beaded around the drain. A single dark smear on the white porcelain near the edge, no bigger than a thumbprint, which could have been dirt or could have been rust from the tap. And the hand towel, which had hung folded and untouched for 19 days, was crumpled on the counter. I called the police that night. I want that on the record, because people always ask why I didn't. I did. A deputy came out at 4:30 in the morning, a young man named Croft with a soft face and a very good manner, and he walked the house with me. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He checked the windows and the doors and the garage. He looked in closets. He shone his light into the crawlspace hatch, and this is the part one still cannot get past, because I asked him to, and he lifted the plywood and put his flashlight down into it and looked for maybe 15 seconds, and then he lowered it back and said there's nothing down there but gravel and a pipe. He was not lying. I've thought about that endlessly. He was not lying, he simply did not go down. It's a 14-inch drop to a gravel bed and the space runs the entire footprint of a house that is over 4,000 square feet, and there are heating ducts and foundation piers and it turns corners, and he shone a light into one end of it and saw gravel and a pipe, because that is what was in the first 8 feet. Before he left he told me that houses like this get squatters sometimes in the off-season. Summer places, empty for months, kids find a way in. He said it in a reassuring tone, as though squatters were a comfortable explanation, and God help me, it was. I latched onto it. Kids. A local teenager with a way in through a window latch, coming in to use the bathroom and drink the milk and sit in the chair, and I would find the window and I would fix it and that would be that. I found the window the next day. 3rd floor, north side, a small casement in an unused bedroom that didn't quite seat because the frame had shifted. It was not, on inspection, a window a person could get through without effort, and it was 11 feet off a sloped roof, and there was no ladder marks in the soft ground below it, but it was open a half-inch and I closed it and screwed it shut with a bracket from the utility drawer and I felt, briefly, wonderful. 3 good days followed. I actually wrote 900 words, then 2,000, then 3,100, sitting at the long table with the lake going silver in front of me and my coffee at my elbow, and I remember thinking that all I had needed was a problem to solve. Fear had just been backed up energy. Now it was flowing again. On the 4th day I found my hairbrush in the wrong drawer. Such a small thing. I keep it in the top drawer of the bathroom vanity. It was in the 2nd drawer, under a folded washcloth, and there was hair in it, which there always is, but the hair was wound around the bristles in a way I don't do. I wind it around my finger and pull it off in a knot and drop it in the bin. This was wrapped, deliberately, like thread on a spool. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub and looked at that brush for a long time. And here is where I have to tell you about the thing I have never told anyone except my sister, and I told her badly, 3 years later, drunk, at Christmas. I did not run. I had a car. It had gas in it. The road was open, the weather was fine, I had a phone with 2 bars and a bank account with money in it, and I could have been in a motel in Kettle Ridge in 90 minutes. And I sat on the edge of that bathtub and I thought about what it would mean to leave. I thought about calling the Halvorsens in Portugal and telling them I was frightened by a hairbrush. I thought about my sister's face. I thought about the manuscript, and the 3 good days, and the fact that I had nowhere else to go, not really, because the apartment was gone and the marriage was gone and this house was the only address I had. And I thought, and I remember this thought with total clarity, if I leave because of this, I will have been the kind of person who leaves. That sentence has cost me more than anything else in my life. So I stayed, and I got smart instead, which felt like courage and was actually just a more sophisticated form of staying. I bought a cheap trail camera from the hardware store in Kettle Ridge, the kind hunters strap to trees, motion-triggered, infrared, records to a card. I bought a wedge-shaped door alarm that shrieks when the door moves. I bought a length of chain and a padlock. And I bought a claw hammer, which I put under the bed, and which I want you to remember, because it comes back. I set the trail camera in the hallway on the ground floor, tucked on a bookshelf behind a row of paperbacks with just the lens showing, aimed down the hall toward the kitchen and the utility room door. I set the wedge alarm under my bedroom door. I chained the utility room door handle to the pipe beside it, which I realize now was insane, because I was chaining the door to keep something in rather than out, and I did that without ever once articulating to myself what I thought was in there. Then I waited. Nothing happened for 6 nights. 6 nights of the wedge alarm sitting silent and the trail camera collecting 140 clips of nothing, which I reviewed every morning, fast-forwarding through gray footage of an empty hall, the way you check email. On the 7th night the camera recorded 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I found it the next morning. I remember the little screen, 3 inches wide, and the file listed among the others with its length beside it, 11 minutes 40, when every other file was the 15-second minimum. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and I played it. The hallway, gray-green in the infrared. Empty for the first 40 seconds. Then, at the far end, at the utility room door, movement. The chain was still on. I want to be clear. The chain was on the handle and the padlock was locked and I had the only key, and the door opened anyway, 4 inches, which is all the chain allowed, and then stopped. And something came out through the 4 inches. Not fast. Not like a person squeezing through a gap. It was slow and patient and it took, by the timestamp, almost 2 minutes, and what emerged first was a hand, and then a forearm, and then a shoulder rotated at an angle that a shoulder can achieve, actually, if you're thin and willing to hurt yourself, and I have seen the footage perhaps 40 times and I still cannot say with confidence whether what I was watching was impossible or merely wrong. He was a man. That much was clear. Thin to the point of illness, in dark clothes, with a knit cap. Once he was out he stood up in the hallway and he stretched, unhurried, rolling his neck, the way you do getting out of a car after a long drive. And then he looked at the camera. There is no way he could have seen the lens. It was behind a row of books, in the dark, with no visible indicator light. He looked directly at it, and he held that look for 4 seconds, and then he turned and walked out of frame toward the stairs. Toward me. The rest of the clip is 9 minutes of empty hallway. He comes back at the end, walks past without a glance, and goes into the utility room, and the door closes, and the last frame of the file is a hallway with a chain door at the end of it, exactly as I had left it. I did not scream. I've thought about why. I think it's because there's a level of fear that shuts your throat rather than opens it. What I did was very carefully stop the video, put the camera down on the floor beside me, and sit there for about half an hour, and during that half hour the thing I kept coming back to was not the hand or the shoulder or the look at the lens. It was the 9 minutes. He had been upstairs for 9 minutes with me asleep. The wedge alarm had not gone off. That meant he had not opened my bedroom door. which meant he had spent 9 minutes standing outside it. I called Deputy Croft. He came out within the hour, and this time there were 2 of them, and this time they were not reassuring, and I watched a professional police officer's face change while he watched that footage, and it is the only part of this entire story that gave me any comfort at all, because it meant I was not mad. They went into the crawlspace properly. Croft took the plywood up and got down on his stomach with a light and went in, and he was gone for a long time, long enough that his partner started calling to him, and when he came back out his uniform was gray with dust and there was a particular blankness on him. He said, "Ma'am, I need you to pack a bag." Under that house, in the crawlspace, in a corner behind the ductwork about 60 feet from the hatch, where the foundation stepped down and made a pocket of space about 4 feet high, somebody had built a room. Not built. That's too strong. Arranged. There was a mattress pad, the thin foam kind, and 3 blankets folded at the foot of it, folded properly, with corners. There was a plastic crate turned on its side as a shelf. On the shelf, a camping lantern, a paperback with the cover torn off, a bottle of hand sanitizer, a comb, and a jar of instant coffee. There was a 5-gallon bucket with a lid, which I will not describe further. There was a length of garden hose spliced into the water line, ending in a spigot over a plastic basin. And there was a hole in the subfloor of the coat closet in the front hall. A neat one, cut with a jigsaw, about 18 inches square, with the carpet cut to match and laid back over it so that it fell perfectly into place. That was how he came and went. Not the utility hatch. The closet. He had used the utility hatch on the camera footage because the chain was on the door and he had wanted, I think, to see whether I would notice the door opening. He had wanted to see what I would do. The county estimated, from the dust patterns and the food wrappers, that he had been living down there for at least 5 months. Which meant he had been under that house since May. Which meant he had been under that house for 4 months before I ever arrived, and had been there through the Halvorsons' last summer weekend, and through the caretaker's autumn visit, and he was there when I pulled up the drive with 2 suitcases and a box of books and thought, what a beautiful place to be alone. They never caught him. I want to say that plainly, because I know how stories like this are supposed to end, and this one doesn't. There was no arrest. There was no name. The prints they lifted came back to nothing in any database. There was a description from my footage, thin white male, 30 to 50, 5 foot 10 or so, and there was a canvas of the shore road, and there was an entry in a system somewhere, and then there was nothing, for years, and there is still nothing. He simply stopped. The night the deputies came, he was gone, and none of his things had been taken, not even the comb. I did not spend another night in that house. I drove to Kettle Ridge at 4 in the afternoon with a bag on the passenger seat, and I sat in a motel room with the chain on and the television off, and I did not sleep. I called the Halvorsons. I resigned. They were very clear, not at fault, and they were kind about it in the specific, slightly airless way of people who are already thinking about their property value. And that should be the end. A bad thing happened, it was discovered, I left, I healed. Here's what actually happened. I healed. That part's true. It took 2 years and a good therapist and a great deal of talking, but I got to a place where I could sleep with the door closed and not lie there listening. I moved to a city. I got a small apartment on the 4th floor with 1 door and no crawlspace and a window that looked at a brick wall, and I loved that brick wall the way other people love a view. I finished the manuscript. It's not about any of this. It's about a woman who runs a bakery, and it did fine. And in the 3rd spring after, I got a package. No return address, postmarked from a town 200 miles from anywhere I've lived. Inside was a paperback with the cover torn off. It was a novel I've never read, some airport thriller from the 90s, and it had been read hard, the spine broken in a dozen places. And on the inside of the back cover, in small neat pencil, someone had made a list. It was a list of what I did. Not what I did in the house. What I do. Wakes 6:40 most days, 7:15 Sundays. Coffee, 2. Walks the road, 40 to 50 minutes, returns by the low gate. Reads in the afternoon. Sleeps on her left side. Locks the deck door but not the top bolt on the road door. Petrus Alto had told me about that top bolt on my second day. I never used it. Not once in 26 days. The list ran to 4 pages of that book's back matter, in that same small pencil, and there were dates beside some of the entries going back to the day I arrived, and at the end, under the last entry, there was one more line that was not an observation. It said, "You were good company." I gave it to the police. Of course I did. They took it, and they were thorough, and there were no prints on it because there are never any prints on it, and they told me that in cases like this the offender often wants to re-establish contact and that it very rarely escalates and that I should install a camera. I did install a camera. I have 4 now. I have a door with 2 locks and a bar, and I have a dog, a big anxious shepherd named Ollie who barks at radiators, and I have a habit I cannot break, which is that I check the temperature of things. Cups. Chairs. The seat of the car when I get in after work. I put my hand flat on them, casually, like I'm steadying myself, and I feel for warmth. My sister has noticed. She thinks it's a tic, and I let her think that, because the truth is embarrassing and the truth is this, I am not really checking for danger. I'm checking to see whether he's still coming. Because in 3 years the fear has changed shape, the way things do when you live with them long enough. It used to be the fear of being found. It is not that anymore. What wakes me now, at 1:30, on the nights when I get up and pour a glass of milk and stand at the counter of my safe 4th-floor apartment with the brick wall outside, is a much quieter thing. He was under that house for 5 months before I came. He watched me for 26 days. He stood outside my door for 9 minutes, and he had a hammer's worth of chances, and every single night he went back down into the gravel and folded his blankets at the foot of the mattress with the corners squared. He never hurt me. He never took anything. He wrote down that I sleep on my left side and that I was good company, and then he let me go. I have spent 3 years trying not to understand what that means. Because the explanations available to me are all worse than fear. He was ill. He was harmless. He was waiting for something specific and I never gave it to him. Or, and this is the one that comes at 1:30, he was not there for me at all. I was simply what happened to be in the house he lived in. I was the weather. And when the weather turned, he moved on. There's one more thing. Last October I went back to Ellendale. Not to the house. I want to be clear about that, I did not go near the house. I drove out to see Petrus Alto, because he had written to me once, an actual letter, in an old man's handwriting, saying that he was sorry and that he'd known something was off about that place for 2 summers and hadn't said so plainly because he hadn't wanted to sound like a crank. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault. That was the whole purpose of the trip. He died in March. His daughter was clearing the house. She was lovely about it, made me coffee, let me sit in her father's kitchen while she wrapped his dishes in newspaper, and we talked about him for an hour. And as I was leaving she said, "Oh," and she went into the other room and came back with a shoebox and said, "He had these, and I don't know what to do with them, and I wondered if they meant something to you." Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Taken with a long lens from up the shore road of the Halvorsen house, across all 4 seasons. In some of them the house is empty. In some of them there's a woman on the deck with a coffee cup, and the woman is me. And in 11 of them, taken over 3 consecutive nights in the 3rd week of October, there is a light on in a window of a house I know for a fact I never lit. It's the 3rd floor north bedroom. The one with the casement window I screwed shut. The photographs are dated. 2 of the 3 nights, I was already in Kettleridge. I gave those to the police too. They took them, and they were thorough, and they told me the timestamps on old cameras drift. Maybe they do. But I think about Petrus Alto sometimes, 70-some years old, standing on that shore road in the cold with a camera, night after night, watching a house he didn't like, taking pictures of a light in a window and never once picking up the phone. I think he was doing what I did. Building explanations. Keeping the evening pleasant. And I think about a man in a knit cap who folded his blankets with the corners squared, who is somewhere right now, tonight, in the dark under someone's floor, listening to them move around above him and learning what time they wake up. He'll write it down. He's very organized. And in 5 months, or 8, or a year, when they finally find the space he's made under their house and they stand there with a flashlight looking at a mattress pad and a comb and a jar of instant coffee, they'll feel exactly what I felt, which is not horror. It's rudeness, oddly. That's the closest word. The sheer, staggering rudeness of it. That someone can decide to live in the space you occupy, learn you like a subject, watch you sleep, drink from your glass, and then leave a note saying you were good company, and never once, not for a single second, be required to explain themselves. Lock the top bolt. That's all. That's the only useful thing I have. The one you have to reach for. People forget the top one. Somebody had made my bed. That's how it started. Not a broken window, not a footprint in the flower bed. I came home from a 12-hour night shift at 8:10 in the morning, and my bed, which I had left the way I always leave it, thrown open and twisted like something had crawled out of it in a hurry, was made. Sheet pulled flat. Duvet squared. The pillow given a little dent in the middle the way they do it in hotels. I stood in the doorway with my coat still on and my keys still in my hand, and I laughed. Out loud, alone, at 8 in the morning. Because what else do you do? My name is Dessa. I was 34 and I worked nights in the cardiac unit at Marrow General, and I lived in a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building called the Ambervale, which was 90 years old and smelled permanently of radiator dust and other people's cooking. I had lived there 6 years. I loved it, in the specific way you love somewhere you can afford. Night shift does something to your relationship with your own home. You come back as the world is starting up. You draw the blackout curtains at 9 in the morning while somebody's kid is shouting on the sidewalk below, and you sleep through the loudest hours of the day, and you wake at 4 in the afternoon feeling like the last person on earth. Your apartment is a place you are only ever unconscious in. 12 hours away, 7 hours asleep, 5 hours of moving around it like a guest. So when things changed, I was slow to notice. That's not carelessness. That's just what the schedule does. The bed was the first thing I couldn't explain, but it wasn't the first thing. Going back, there were weeks of small business. A drawer that I'd have sworn was closed, standing open an inch. The bathroom mirror wiped clean of the toothpaste flecks I never got around to. My shoes by the door, which I kick off and leave where they land, sitting side by side with the toes pointed out toward the hall. Tidy things. That's what unnerved me later, once I let myself line them up. Nothing was ever taken. Nothing was ever broken or moved somewhere strange. My apartment was simply, gradually, getting better. I told my friend Ivy about the bed over coffee and she said, honestly, if a man wants to break into my place and clean it, my door is open. And we laughed, and I let her make it funny, because the alternative was letting it be what it was. I changed the lock anyway. A locksmith came out, a bored young guy who did it in 20 minutes and charged me for an hour, and he asked how many keys I wanted and I said one. Just the one. He gave me a strange look and gave me one key, and I put it on my ring, and for 11 days everything was fine. On the 12th day I woke up at 2:30 in the afternoon because I was cold. The window was open. 4 inches, sash up, the curtain moving. 3rd floor, no fire escape on that side, and I do not open that window, ever, because the sash cord broke in my 2nd year there and the whole thing drops like a guillotine if you don't prop it. It was propped. With a hardcover book from my own shelf, laid flat on the sill. I lay in bed and looked at that for a long time in the gray filtered light, and then I got up and I took the book out and let the window fall, and the crash of it was the loudest sound that apartment had ever made. I called the police, and they came, and they were kind, and they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. No forced entry. New lock. 3rd floor. The officer asked, gently, whether I'd been sleeping properly, and I said I work nights, and he nodded like that answered something, and I understood that in his notebook I had just become a woman with a sleep problem. Here's the part one think about most. That evening, on my way out to shift, I ran into Mr. Oren in the stairwell. He was the building's handyman, had been for 22 years, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a ring of keys on his belt so heavy it pulled his trousers down on one side. He'd fixed my radiator twice and my toilet once, and he always knocked and waited and never came and passed the doorway without asking. He said, I heard the police were up. And I told him. I told him all of it, standing on the 2nd floor landing with my bag on my shoulder, because I badly needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't laugh. He listened. He listened very well. And when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, Miss Dessa, that window, the sash cord, I never did come fix that, did I? I said no. He said, I'll get to it. And then he said, you should sleep better. You look tired. I went to work. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, in the fluorescent hum of the unit, with a monitor beeping steadily behind me, it landed on me. He knew about the sash cord. I had never reported it. Not once in 4 years. I had never put in a maintenance ticket, never mentioned it, because I didn't use the window and it wasn't worth the bother, and I had told exactly nobody. I stood in that corridor at 4 in the morning and felt the floor go strange under me. I did not go home. I went to Ivy's. I sat on her couch at 8:30 in the morning shaking, and she believed me, all of it, immediately, which is the greatest kindness anyone has ever done me. And she called her cousin who was a sergeant somewhere, and things moved after that in a way they had not moved before. They found his own apartment first, the basement unit, and it was completely ordinary. Clean. A recliner, a television, a photograph of a woman who turned out to be his late wife. Nothing in it at all. The other room took them another day. The Ambervale had a service corridor running behind the bathroom stacks, a crawl of a space 18 inches wide, meant for plumbers, running the full height of the building. There was a hatch on every floor. And in the 3rd floor section, directly behind my bathroom wall, tucked between the pipes where the space widened out by a foot, there was a stool. Just a stool. A folding camp stool, and a clipboard hung on a nail, and a hole the diameter of a pencil drilled through the plaster of my bathroom wall at the height of a seated man's eye, and behind the hole, on my side, the little chrome cap of a toilet paper holder screw that I had looked at every day for 6 years. The clipboard had names on it. 9 of them. Apartment numbers, and names, and dates, going back years. Mine was the most recent, and mine had the most pages. He'd written down when I left and when I came back. He'd written down what I ate, which he could see from the kitchen doorway. He'd written down that I cried on the 14th of March, and I did, I remember why, and it was a private thing and it was mine, and now it was on a clipboard behind a wall. And in the margin, next to entries from the last 2 months, in a slightly different pen, he had written small notes to himself. Shoes. Mirror. Bed. A list of things to do for me. Chores. He had been keeping house. He pled to trespass and unlawful surveillance and served 11 months, and the last thing he said in court, when the judge asked whether he wanted to speak, was that he had never touched anyone and never would, and that he only wanted to be useful, and that after his wife died the building was all he had. I moved, obviously. Ground floor now, other side of the city, a place with a camera over the door that I check more than I should. But I'll tell you the thing that stayed. For 6 years I had come home at 8 in the morning to an empty apartment and a made bed I hadn't made and a mirror I hadn't cleaned, and some part of me, some small starved part, had taken those things as evidence that the world was being gentle with me. I had felt, in a way I never said out loud, looked after. He gave me that. A man behind a wall with a pencil hole and a clipboard gave me the only sense of being cared for that I had in those years. That's what I can't put down. Not the hole. Not the stool. That it worked. That for a while, before I knew, it was the nicest thing anybody had done for me. There's a sound a house makes in deep snow, and it isn't silence, it's the opposite. Snow takes away all the far noises, the road and the wind and the far tree lean and the distant hum of everything, and what's left is your own house, very close, working. That night the Ellery farmhouse was ticking and settling and breathing around us like something with lungs, and my wife Nora said, without looking up from her book, "Somebody's out there." I said, "In this?" "Nobody's out in this." And she said, "I didn't say somebody's coming. I said somebody's out there." That was the 20th of December, and by then we'd had 31 inches in 4 days and the county had stopped plowing the secondary roads. We were 8 miles from Ellery proper on a road that dead-ended at our gate, and there was one other house on that road, the Prosser place, empty since October. We had a generator, a full propane tank, 2 chest freezers and a 9-year-old daughter named June who thought the whole thing was the greatest event of her life. I'm Martin. I taught high school chemistry for 19 years and I am not, by nature, a man who believes things are out there. The knock came at 9:20. 3 knocks. Unhurried. Spaced evenly, the way a person knocks when they are certain someone is home. June looked up. Nora put her book face down on the arm of the chair. I remember thinking, very clearly, that there was no engine sound. Not before, not during. In snow that deep you hear an engine from a mile out, and I had heard nothing all evening but our own generator. I went to the door and I did not open it. There was a small window beside it, and I put the porch light on and looked. A man stood at the bottom of the steps. 60s, maybe. Heavy coat, no hat, snow in his hair, which meant he had been outside long enough to collect it but not long enough to be buried in it. His face was red with cold. He had no bag, no gloves, no flashlight. He said, through the door, "I'm sorry to trouble you. My car's off the road up by the turn." I said, "There's no car been up that road." He said, "Well, it's off the road." And he smiled, and it was a perfectly decent smile, and Nora, behind me, said quietly, "Martin, don't." I told him I'd call it in for him. I told him the sheriff had a plow truck and could get out to the turn by morning, and that if he'd wait on the porch I'd bring him out coffee and a blanket, and I meant it, and I want that on the record because I've been called a hard man about this since. He said, "That's kind. That's very kind." And then he said, "Is the phone working? Because the pole came down at the bottom of your drive around 6. I hadn't looked at the phone since dinner." Nora picked it up. Dead. And that was the moment. Not the knock. That. Because a stranded man doesn't know when your pole came down. He knows there's no signal. He doesn't know 6. I said, through the door, as level as I could manage, "You go on and get off my porch now." He stood there. He didn't argue and he didn't plead. He looked at the door, and then he looked up, slightly, at the second floor, at June's window, which was the only other lit window on that side of the house, and he did it casually, the way you check the weather. Then he said, "All right," and he walked back down the drive into the dark, and there was no sound of a car, and there was never any car. We didn't sleep. We put June in our bed and I sat in the chair by the stairs with a shotgun across my knees that I had not loaded in 6 years and had to look for the shells for. Nora sat on the top step with the fireplace poker and her phone showing no bars, and we watched the windows go from black to gray. At about 2 in the morning the generator stopped. I want you to understand what that's like. Everything goes at once. The lights, the furnace fan, the well pump, the little green digital clocks all over a house that you never notice until they're not there. And what's left is a 100-year-old farmhouse in 31 inches of snow with no sound in it but your own family breathing. I did not go out to the generator. That's the second thing I've been called hard about, and I'd do it again. The generator sat in a shed 40 feet from the back door, and getting to it meant being outside in the dark, and I had a daughter upstairs, and I have thought about it every single day for 11 years and I would still not go out. I have never told anyone the whole of what those hours were like, because there is nothing in them. That's the part you can't convey. Nothing happened for 6 hours, and it was the worst 6 hours of my life. Cold comes into a house in layers. First the extremities of the building, the mudroom and the north hall, and then the ground floor, and then it starts up the stairs. By 4 in the morning I could see my own breath in the front room. June was asleep in our bed under 3 quilts and Nora would not leave the top step, and I sat in that chair with the shotgun and did the only thing there was to do, which was listen. And a house in the dark is not quiet. I've said that already, but I want to be precise about what it does to you. Every 20 minutes or so the beams would give a single sharp report as the temperature dropped, a crack like a knuckle, and my whole body would come up off that chair. Snow slid off the porch roof twice and each time it sounded exactly like a man landing in the drift. The chimney breathed. Somewhere in the walls a mouse was doing something urgent. And under all of it was the terrible mathematics of the thing, which was that I had one door I could watch and 11 windows I could not, and he knew that, because he had walked past every one of them. Around 5 Nora came down and sat on the arm of the chair and put her hand flat on the back of my neck and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she said, "If he comes in, you don't wait. You don't ask him anything." I said I know. She said, "I mean it, Martin. You are not to be reasonable. That's my wife. 31 years, and that is the single most useful sentence anyone has ever said to me." Twice I thought I heard the back door handle. Both times I stood up and both times there was nothing, and the second time I made myself walk into the kitchen in the dark to look at it, and standing in that kitchen with the window black and my own reflection nowhere to be seen because there was no light behind me to make one, I had the strongest feeling of my life that if I put my face close to the glass, his would be on the other side of it, for inches away, waiting for exactly that. I didn't put my face close to the glass. I went back to the chair. And at some point in there, I stopped being frightened for us and started being frightened of something worse, which was the thought of the morning. Because I understood that if we got through it, we would get through it without knowing. There would be no resolution. There would just be a man out there in the county somewhere, and the rest of our lives, and every winter after this one. That turned out to be exactly right, for 4 days. We lasted the night. At first light Nora saw the tracks. They came out of the tree line behind the property, not from the road. They crossed to the generator shed, where the fuel line had been pulled loose, not cut, just pulled, which anyone could reverse in a minute, which I think was the point. Then they went to the back door and stood there. Then along the whole back of the house, under every window, pausing at each one, and you could see where he'd stood because the snow was packed down flat by shifting weight. Under the kitchen window, the packed patch was 3 feet across. He'd stood there a long time. Then the tracks went around the side, to the porch, up the steps, and I sat down on those steps in my coat at 7 in the morning and understood that the man who knocked on my door at 9:20 had already walked the entire house before he knocked. He had known which rooms were lit. He had known where we were. He had known about the pole. And then he had come around to the front and knocked politely and given us the chance to open the door. They caught him. That part one get to have. 4 days later, 30 miles east, at a place called the Nadeau Farm, where an 81-year-old woman named Constance Nadeau did open the door, because she was 81 and alone and someone was knocking in the snow. She lived. She spent 2 months in Mero General and she lived, and she testified, and he is going to die in a state facility, and I have never met her but I send a card every December and she sends one back. What I carry isn't the man. He was, in the end, an ordinary sort of monster, and the trial made him small. What I carry is the knock. Because I have gone over it 1,000 times and I cannot find the flaw in it. If he had rattled the handle, we'd have known. If he'd broken the glass, we'd have known. Instead he stood at the bottom of my steps in the snow, hatless and gloveless, red-faced and reasonable, and he said, "I'm sorry to trouble you." He gave me every reason to open that door. Politeness. Weather. Age. Decency. He handed me my own decency and asked me to use it, and the only thing that saved my family was one number. 6. If he'd said, "The pole's down somewhere," I'd have opened the door. I taught for another 11 years after that and I retired last spring, and June is grown and has a house of her own with a gravel drive I don't like, and there's a thing I've never been able to say to her properly, so I'll say it here. The lock on your door isn't a wall. It's a delay. Everything after that is you, deciding, in about 4 seconds, with somebody's face in your window and their voice being kind. Be ready to be rude. That's all. Be ready to be the kind of person who leaves a decent man on a porch in the snow. I have never once regretted it, and I have never once slept easy about it either, and I've made my peace with holding both. I install security systems for a living, which is why what happened to me is funny, in the way that only very bad things can be funny to the person they happen to. 22 years. Cameras, sensors, glass break detectors, the whole trade. I have stood in 1,400 houses and told 1,400 people that the point of a system is not to stop anyone. The point is to make you a harder house than the one next door. That's the entire industry, in one sentence. You are not building a fortress, you are simply arranging to be second choice. My name's Warren. I'm 56. I live alone in a split level on Kittry Road that I bought when I was 30 and my ex-wife picked out the kitchen tile. My house had 11 cameras. I want to lead with that. The trouble started as a latency problem, which is the sort of thing that annoys a professional long before it frightens a person. I'd walk in the front door and glance at the hall panel and see myself walking in the front door, half a second behind. That's normal. A little lag is normal. But mine went to a full second, then 2, then on some nights 4 or 5, and only on the interior cameras, never the exterior ones. I did what any of us would. I checked the network, swapped the switch, ran new cable to 2 of them, rebuilt the recorder. The lag stayed. I put it down to a firmware update and I let it go, because it was July and I was busy and the system was recording fine. Then in August I noticed the recordings were clean. Too clean. 41 nights of interior footage and not a single motion event that wasn't me. That's not how houses work. Houses have moths, and headlights sweeping the ceiling, and a curtain moving over a vent. In a normal August I'd expect 200 junk events. I had none. Somebody had tuned my system. Somebody had gone through the sensitivity thresholds on the interior cameras, camera by camera, and raised them just enough to swallow everything small, and left the exteriors exactly as they were so the event count still looked healthy in the weekly report. I sat in my own living room at 11 at night and understood that whoever did that knew the software better than most of my technicians. I did not sleep in that house again. I got a room at the Cross Pines Motel that same night and I called a friend at the sheriff's office in the morning, and he humored me because he knows what I do for a living and figured I'd know what I was looking at. I want to describe the 2 days between the motel and the attic, because that gap is where the real thing lives. I did not sit in that motel room feeling hunted. I sat in it feeling professionally humiliated, which is a much stranger and more corrosive emotion, and I went through my own system the way I'd go through a client's. I pulled the configuration files onto my laptop and I read them line by line, the way you read a contract you've already signed. Somebody had been in there with real care. The interior camera sensitivity had been raised, yes, but that was the crude part. The elegant part was the retention schedule. My interior cameras were set to keep 30 days. In the config, someone had set the interior channels to overwrite at 7, and then edited the display string in the management page so that it still said 30. That's not a setting you change. That's a modification. That is somebody who sat with my recorder and made it lie to me in a way that would survive being checked. And the timestamps on the file changes were all between 2 and 4 in the morning. I remember reading that in a motel room with the air conditioner rattling and having a very particular thought, which was, he was doing that downstairs while I was asleep upstairs. Not hiding. Working. Sitting at my equipment rack in the basement with a laptop, taking his time, tidying up after himself, and then going back up to the attic before light. 13 months of that. The other thing I found was the lag, and the lag turned out to be the whole story. Interior video was arriving at my panel a beat late because it was not coming from my cameras. It was being passed through something else first and handed back. He had inserted himself into the path. Everything I saw on that panel for over a year, I saw because he allowed it to reach me. I called my friend at the sheriff's office and I told him, I think there is a man living in my house, and I need you to come with me, and I do not want to be the one who opens the panel. We found it in the attic. There's a knee wall in that house, a triangular dead space behind the upstairs closets that runs the whole length of the building. You get to it through a panel in the back of the guest room closet, which I had opened exactly twice, both times in the first year, both times to run cable. There was a mattress. There was a camp lantern. There was a laptop with a cellular dongle, wired directly into my own network, and on the laptop, in a neat folder structure, 13 months of footage of me. Not stolen from my cameras. His own. He had installed 4 of his own, small ones, in the ceiling vents, and they were better than mine, and they were pointed at the places mine were not, which is to say the bathroom and the bedroom and the chair where I sit. And I knew whose they were, because I recognized the mounting brackets. We used to buy them from a supplier in Merrow that went under in 2009. I had 2 boxes of them in my own garage. His name was Douglas Rank. He worked for me from 2004 to 2011. Good technician, quiet, no complaints. I let him go in a slow year, along with 2 others, and I remember the conversation lasting about 4 minutes, and I remember he said, "Thank you for everything, Warren," and shook my hand. He installed the original system in my house. In 2006. As a favor, on a Saturday, and I bought him lunch. He had run a set of parallel drops that day, and left them capped and coiled in the knee wall, and they had sat there dead for 15 years, and in the spring of the year before he came back and plugged them in. They arrested him at a storage unit in Kettle Ridge. He didn't resist. He'd been living in the knee wall of my house 4 or 5 nights a week and in the storage unit the rest of the time, and he had a laminated card in his wallet with my alarm code on it, in his own handwriting, from the day he installed it. The prosecutor asked him, at one point, what he wanted. What the intention was. And he said something I have not been able to shake. He said, "I wanted to see if he ever checked." 15 years those cables sat there. He plugged them in and waited to see if I would notice. And I didn't, and he stayed, and he kept waiting, and every week I did not notice was, I think, an answer to a question he had been asking me since 2011. The house sold in November. I didn't renovate it, I didn't rip out the knee wall, I just sold it as it stood to a young couple who wanted the yard, and I disclosed everything I was legally required to disclose and nothing more, and I have thought about that too. I'm still in the business. I still stand in strangers' houses and tell them the truth, which is that the system is a delay and a deterrent and a record, and it is not a wall. But I've added a line to the pitch. I tell them, whoever installs this knows your house better than you ever will. Not to frighten them. They laugh, usually. It sounds like a joke about tradesmen. I mean it completely. There is a version of every home that only the person who wired it has ever seen. The spaces behind the spaces. The chases and the voids and the cavities that exist in every building and that no one who lives there ever has cause to look at. Your house is bigger on the inside than you know, and somebody has a map. I keep mine in a drawer now. All of them. 1,400 houses, and I've never been able to bring myself to throw a single drawing away, and I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what that means. I started leaving out the biscuits in November. Shortbread, the plain kind in the red tin, 3 of them on a saucer on the kitchen table before I went up to bed. And in the morning they'd be gone, and the saucer would be pushed a little to the left, and I'd wash it and dry it and put it back in the cupboard and get on with my day. I'm 82. My name is Ruth Ann. My husband Bern died in the March of that year, in the front room, in a hospital bed that 4 men carried in through the bay window because it wouldn't go round the stairs. After the funeral my son wanted me in a flat near him in the city and I said no, and we had words about it, and the words are why he didn't call for 8 weeks, and the 8 weeks are why nobody noticed anything for so long. The first sign was the heating. I keep it low, always have, and I'd come down in the morning and the house would be warm, properly warm, the way Bern used to have it because he felt the cold. I thought the timer had gone wrong. I had a man out. He said the timer was fine and charged me £40. Then the front gate. It squeaks, and it had stopped squeaking, and when I looked there was oil on the hinge, fresh, and a little run of it down the post. Then the bulb on the landing, which had gone out in September and which I could not reach and had been meaning to ask someone about, and which one morning in October was working. I want to tell you what I felt, and I need you to not think less of me for it. I felt relief. I stood at the bottom of my own stairs looking up at a light I had not changed, and I thought, oh, thank God. Because for 7 months this house had been doing nothing but taking things away. Burns' chair went. His clothes went to the charity shop. His voice went off the answering machine when the machine broke. Every single week the house had less in it, and here, at last, was something the house had given back. I did not want to know. That's the truth of it. I made a decision at the bottom of those stairs, and I made it in about 2 seconds, and I made it wide awake. So I left out the biscuits. I don't know how to explain that except to say that when you are alone in a house that used to have 2 people in it, the silence isn't empty, it's expectant. It's waiting for the other one to come in from the garden. And here was something moving about in the night, warming the rooms, oiling the gate, eating the shortbread, and I would lie upstairs and listen to a floorboard go in the hall and feel my heart settle, and I would sleep better than I had since March. 4 months. I should describe those nights, because I have made them sound cozier than they were, and that isn't fair to either of us. I would go up at 9:30. I have always gone up at 9:30, burned 46 years of it. I would lie there in the dark with the street light coming through the gap in the curtain, and at some point between 11 and 1 there would be a sound at the side of the house, very small, a scrape and then a soft settling, and then nothing for a long while. 10 minutes, sometimes 20. He would stand down there in the dark and listen, I suppose, to be certain of me. Then the kitchen. The tap, always, first thing, run for a few seconds. The chair pulled out. And after that a slow, patient sort of moving about that went on for an hour or more, and I could follow it. I knew every board in that house. I could tell you when he was at the sink and when he was in the hall and when he had stopped at the front room door and stood there. He stood at the front room door most nights. That was where the bed had been. Where Byrne died. I don't know what he did there and I don't know that he did anything, but he stopped, every night, in the same place, for the same minute or 2, and then he moved on. There were nights I hated it. I want that said as well, because people hear this story and decide I was simply a lonely old fool who welcomed it, and it was not so tidy as that. There were nights I lay rigid with my hands and fists on the counterpane and thought, this is a stranger, in my house, and I am a woman of 82 with a bad hip and a telephone on the wrong side of the room. There were nights I felt sick with it. And then in the morning I would come down to a warm kitchen and a washed saucer and the feeling would go, the way a dream goes, and I would think, well, nothing happened. Nothing happened, 4 months running. That's a very persuasive argument. It's the most persuasive argument there is, and it is worth precisely nothing, and I knew that at the time. He never came upstairs. I want that said. In 4 months he never once came up, and I know because I put a thread across the 3rd step, an old trick from a book, and it was never broken, not one night. I started leaving other things. A cup of tea, going cold on the table, which was foolish. A pair of Byrne's gloves, because it turned cold and I thought, whoever you are, your hands. A note once, only once, that said, there is soup in the pan, please wash it after. The soup was eaten. The pan was washed. It was on the drainer, upside down, the way Byrne did it and the way I never do. I nearly went down, that night. I sat on the edge of my bed at 2:30 with my dressing gown on and my hand on the door, and I thought about going down those stairs and putting the kitchen light on and simply looking at him. I didn't. And I've had 6 years to work out why, and the answer is not fear. It's that a thing you can see is a thing that has to be dealt with. A man in my kitchen would have been a police matter, and a statement, and my son on the phone saying I told you, and a flat near him in the city with a view of a car park. But a floorboard in the night was mine. It was the only thing in that entire year that was mine and nobody else's, and I was not going to spend it. In March he stopped. No note, nothing. I came down and the biscuits were there on the saucer, 3 of them, and the house was cold, and the gate squeaked again by the end of the month. I left the saucer out for 11 more nights. I did eventually tell someone. A woman from the council came about a rail for the bath, a good sort, and it came out sideways and I heard myself saying it and I couldn't stop. She was very calm. She called it in. 2 officers came and they were patient with me and they looked and they found where he'd got in, a coal chute at the side of the house that Byrne had boarded over in the 80s, and the boards were off and back on again, screwed from the inside. And under the stairs, in the cupboard where the meters are, on the floor, folded up small, they found a sleeping bag and a carrier bag with a razor in it and a photograph. The photograph was of my house. Taken from the road, in summer, with the roses out. They asked me if I knew who might have taken it and I said no, and that was true, and it is still true. The officer, the older one, said something to me on the doorstep as they left that I think he meant kindly. He said, "You were very lucky, Mrs. Hallam. He could have done anything." And I said thank you, and I shut the door, and I stood in the hall. Because that is not what I was thinking. What I was thinking was, he could have done anything, and what he did was fix the landing light. My son moved me in the June. I have a flat now. It's warm and it's safe and there is a woman called Prida who comes on Tuesdays and I am, by every measure anyone would use, better off. There's a communal kitchen down the corridor and I don't use it. I have my own. And on the table in my own kitchen there is a saucer, and on some nights, not every night, not anymore, I put 3 shortbread out before I go to bed. They're always there in the morning. Every single one. 6 years now. I eat them with my tea, and I wash the saucer, and I put it back. I'd just like it said that I know exactly how that sounds, and I do it anyway. The 7th house was where I understood. By then I'd been looking for 4 months. If you've ever house hunted seriously you'll know the state it puts you in, this odd trance of walking through other people's lives with your shoes on, opening their cupboards, judging their taste in tile. You stop seeing houses after a while. You start seeing floor plans with feelings attached. I was 38, newly promoted, newly single, and I had a mortgage approval that expired in the spring, and I was working with an agent named Bettine Soros who had the patience of a geologist. The 7th house was on Renfield Lane, a 1960s bungalow that had been empty 11 months while an estate went through probate. Bettine got the key out of the lockbox and said, "I'll be honest with you, this one needs everything." We went in. It smelled the way empty houses smell, dust and cold plaster and something faintly sweet from the drains. And in the back bedroom, on the carpet, there was an impression. A rectangle, about 6 feet by 2.5, where the pile was crushed flat, and around it, faintly, the outline of where someone had knelt. Bettine said, "Previous owner's bed." I said, "The house has been empty 11 months. Carpet comes back up in 11 months. She didn't have anything for that, and we moved on to the kitchen, and I forgot about it for about 9 days. What brought it back was the 4th house. The 4th house, on Del Barro Close, which I had seen a month earlier, had had exactly the same thing. I remembered it because I had made a joke about it at the time, something about the ghost of a mattress, and Bettine had laughed politely. I went back through my photographs. I photograph everything at viewings, every room, because after 20 houses they blur. It was in 5 of the 7. Same rectangle. Same rough dimensions. And in 3 of them, in the corner of the room, in the skirting board, the same thing, a small round hole, the size of a 5-pence piece, drilled clean, about 4 inches off the floor. I sat in my rented flat at midnight with 40 photographs spread out on the carpet, and I did what people in my position do, which is find a reasonable explanation. Show homes get staged. Estate clearances use standard equipment. Contractors sleep in properties, sometimes, on long jobs. There are 100 boring reasons for a flat patch of carpet. There is no boring reason for the hole in the skirting board. I called Bettine and asked her a very specific question, which was how many agencies had access to the lockboxes on those properties, and she said, well, all of them, that's the whole point of the system, any registered agent can pull the code. I asked how many registered agents there were in the county. She said, 400. Maybe more with the sub-agents. And I sat there with the phone against my ear and thought about a man with a valid credential moving through a network of empty houses across an entire county, sleeping in the good ones, and never once having to break anything, because the entire system is built on the assumption that anyone with the code belongs there. I reported it. It went to a fraud team, then a burglary team, then, eventually, nowhere, because there had been no burglary. Nothing had been taken from any of those houses. There was no offense anyone could get a grip on except trespass, and you can't charge trespass against an unknown person in an unoccupied building that has no visible damage. An officer told me, not unkindly, that this sort of thing was more common than people liked to think. He said there's a whole population living in the gaps. Empty properties, seasonal lets, repossessions, probate houses. He said, you'd be amazed how many houses in this country are standing empty tonight with someone in them. I bought the 8th house. Renfield Lane fell through on the survey, which was a mercy. The 8th house was fine. Is fine. I've been in it 6 years. New locks the first day, both doors, and I had the letterbox changed and the garage rewired, and I did not use a lockbox for the handover. I met the seller in person and took the keys out of her hand. Here's what I didn't do, and I want to be honest about it, because this is the part that matters. I never checked the carpet. There was a rug in the back bedroom when I moved in, a big one, left behind. The seller said take it or I'll skip it. I took it. It's still there. And for 6 years I have known, in the completely useless way that you know things you have decided not to look at, that I have never once lifted that rug. I could do it tonight. It would take 4 minutes. And every time I get near the idea, I find something else to do, and I've stopped pretending that's an accident. Because the thing about that county-wide system of houses is that it doesn't have an edge. Those properties didn't stop being on the list when they sold. They came off one list and onto another, and somewhere there is a person who spent 11 months learning the layout of a bungalow on Renfield Lane and 5 months learning mine, and who now knows exactly where the boiler cupboard is and which floorboard on the landing goes and how the back door has to be lifted slightly on its hinge to lock properly. I asked the officer, at the end, whether people like that move on. Whether they find another area. He said, mostly they just find another house. And I said, on the same street? And he thought about it and said, well, they've already got the code. So there's a rug in my back bedroom. And under it there is either nothing at all, which is almost certainly the case, or there is a rectangle in the pile of the carpet where something has lain, and a small clean hole in the skirting board 4 inches off the floor. I sleep in the front bedroom. I've always told people it's for the light. It isn't for the light. It's because the back bedroom shares a wall with the airing cupboard, and the airing cupboard has a hatch in the ceiling, and I have lived in this house for 6 years and I have never opened it, and there is a part of me that has understood from the very first night that the moment I do, one of 2 things becomes true forever, and only one of them lets me stay. So I don't open it. And every night at about 11:30, when the heating clicks off and the house starts to cool and tick, I lie in the front bedroom and I listen to the sound of my own home settling, and I think, that's what that is. That's all that is. And then I say it again, out loud, into the dark, because saying it out loud is what makes it true.